Neil Gabler is a senior fellow of the Norman Lear Center here at the USC Annenberg School. If you don't know what the Lear Center is, I won't plug it now, but the website is learcenter.org, and you can find out more about it there. He's been a collaborator in our work since the Lear Center was founded, which is now almost 5 years ago, amazingly. And at that point, he had a book come out called Life, the Movie, How Entertainment Conquered Reality. That theme of entertainment taking over everything else is the theme of the Lear Center. He's also written, for example, An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood, the history of the studio moguls, and a biography of Walter Winchell. He's now working on a biography, what will no doubt be the definitive biography of Walt Disney. You also may know him from his op-ed pieces and features in the Los Angeles Times opinion section, and beyond that, just to show you how ecumenical he is a regular on the Fox News media program. The title of the show is Newswatch. And so you can see him opining there in the belly of the beast. It's my great pleasure to invite him to take the podium. Please welcome Neil Gabler.
Thank you very much. I feel like saying welcome to day 16 of the longest wait in history. Or as we like to call it where I come from, America held hostage. You know, I felt, and I'm sure a lot of people do, and I'm giving away my politics here in saying it, that, you know, I went to bed in one country and I woke up in another on November 2nd. And that day, on November 3rd, the country in which I woke up in instantly was being analyzed as to what happened. And almost all the pundits fastened immediately on the exit poll on November 3rd that showed that 22% of the voters identified moral values as the reason that they cast their vote, and that an overwhelming percentage of those people who identified moral values as the reason they cast their vote voted for George Bush, and therefore, you know, in short, that explained what had happened. I think it explains absolutely nothing. In my estimation, I'm very, very dubious about any kind of instant analysis, including my own. So you should take everything I say with a few grains of salt. I'm particularly dubious about this analysis, since, as many of you know, particularly those of you who are floating around in the blogosphere, there are many problems with that 22%, one of which is that it was a list from which people were asked to choose which issue they based their vote upon. And when you have a menu that has Iraq, terrorism, healthcare, and moral values, I'm amazed that only 22% identified moral values, and not a much higher percentage, regardless of where you're coming from politically or on the so-called value spectrum. Secondly, you may know that Pew recently did a much more extensive study in which they had a control. They gave a list of subjects or issues on which you predicated your vote, including moral values. And then they asked you, without any list, to list the issues on which you predicated your vote. And when they provided the list, moral values got, I believe, 23%. When they did not provide the list, it was something like 13%, which immediately tells you that there is something wrong with this whole polling, and I think there's something wrong with the analysis. So let me tell you what I think. I think that elections in America, and this is not only true of the election of 2004, but it's been true of many, many elections, elections in America are not dependent on policy or even issue more broadly defined. or by values even more broadly defined. You know, I think that these things are almost incidental to the way that Americans, most Americans, and I don't exclude myself from this either. I don't want this to become an us and them, you know, dumb people versus smart people, you know, blue state versus red state. I think most of us depend, when we cast our votes, are casting our votes on the basis of narratives and aesthetics. And that elections are waged and won on the basis of who has the more compelling narrative and who has the more appealing aesthetic. And that because we live within narratives all the time, because our lives are dominated by narratives, because narratives, if you buy the thesis of my last book and the thesis of the Lear Center, impregnate themselves into every aspect of our lives, narratives prevail over everything. Narratives and aesthetics trump everything. And so it behooves us, if we're going to understand this election, and not only this election, but because narratives are evolutionary, they are seldom revolutionary. I mean, occasionally they are, but in America they seldom are. It behooves us to understand what these narratives are, what the competition between narratives was, what the competition between aesthetics was, and I think that this will give us, in my estimation, a better handle on what happened on November 2nd than 22% of moral values, which in my estimation get subsumed into this larger notion. Now, you know, having said that, I think it's also important to understand that this is no simple matter. Narratives exist in a welter. They don't exist singly. There is, one might say, a giant meta narrative that almost everyone subscribes to, whether you are on the left or on the right, whether you're in the media or outside the media. I call it the Teddy White narrative. And it's important to understand this narrative because it helps explain many of the things that happen afterwards in analyzing an election, no matter which direction you come from, within the media. And I call it the Teddy White narrative because Teddy White, Theodore White, who wrote The Making of the President in 1960, the first of many books in which he gave a narrative of the presidency, the presidential election itself, all of them best-selling books, which then also set a pattern for the kind of coverage we were going to get from 1960 on. Teddy White operated out of a thesis, which was the system works. Doesn't make any difference who gets elected. I'm giving you a narrative not about Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey in 68, or about Kennedy and Nixon in 60. I'm giving you a narrative of how the system works. And by works, I mean not the mechanics of it, but that in the end, it all turns out all right. How often do we hear about the wisdom of the American people? And you have to trust the wisdom of the American people. Now, I'm not going to challenge that idea, but I think it's important to know that all analysis of election in the media almost always operates within the Teddy White meta-narrative. Look it. It works somehow. Don't despair. Somehow it all works out. The wisdom of the people is important. And it's important to understand that because no one ever challenges the so-called wisdom of the people or the wisdom of the system. No one ever says, well, you know, sometimes, although you may have been saying in the last 2 weeks, the system breaks down. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes what we find out at the end of it all is that this doesn't operate the way it's supposed to operate. Now, I'm not saying that that happened in 2004. All I'm saying is that you have to understand that general context. I mean, I always, my favorite example of that is Watergate. Because at the end of Watergate, people self-congratulatorily said, the system works. To which I would say, you're absolutely right, the system works. If a president of the United States is dumb enough to record every conversation he has, If he's dumb enough not to destroy the tapes when it's clear that if they ever get revealed, he will be impeached. If he has minions who are disloyal enough to go before Congress and announce that he's got these tapes, if it's then, somehow the system allows them to get the tapes, if they then listen to the tapes, and I could go on and on and on, but in a kind of 12-step program, if you hit each of those thresholds, then the system works. Answer, system doesn't work. That will never, ever happen again in the history of this country. So, understand that narrative. Then underneath that narrative, there is what I think most of us would refer to as the master narratives. And the master narratives, presumably, there's a master narrative for the Republican Party and a master narrative for the Democratic Party, and we're all extremely familiar with the master narrative of the Republican Party because it's been operating now for at least 24 years, since 1980, and presumably, since the Republicans don't seem to have any inclination to change this master plot, nor any reason to change this master plot, I assume it's going to continue for the next, 24 or longer. And that is that this is a country of individuals. This is, like Frederick Jackson Turner, this is a country of people who've been forged on the frontier. This is a country of people who stand alone. This is a country of people who are responsible for themselves. This is a country of people who need nothing or anyone other than themselves. This is a country, the threat of which is to that sense of individualism. Whether it's communism or whether it's government, anything that imperils that sense of standing alone is the danger and must be destroyed. And when communism was destroyed, conveniently, terrorism, well, first Bill Clinton, and then terrorism moved in to fill the breach. Because every narrative needs heroes and villains. Every narrative. That's how narratives work. That's why you go to the movies. That's why you watch TV. And you have to think of these narratives in exactly those terms. We're talking about essentially political movies. The only difference being this, that movies generally don't vie against one another. Of course, you can go to the theater and say, do I go to see this movie tonight or go to see that movie tonight? But they're not mutually exclusive. But when it comes to political narratives, they are mutually exclusive. You choose one, you defeat the other, and that's a major difference between the kind of cornucopia of narratives that you have in the popular culture. So that you have that master plot. And I'm not going to address the Democratic master plot advisedly for a reason which I will get to in a moment. Then underneath that master plot, you have how that plot is tailored to the individual time and the individual actor. You've got a plot, but it can be cast in many, many different ways. Ronald Reagan performed within that narrative in a very different way, for example, than George Bush did in 2004. But here is the plot, the plot of the strong, individualistic Americans, set out against government, set out against terrorism, people who need nothing else. And that narrative was tailored, as you saw very quickly and very overtly, to George Bush. Strong. He's strong. He's strong. He's strong. He's strong. I mean, next to 9/11, the word you heard most in this election was strength. The idea that they were obviously counting on was that in a narrative, it makes no difference what you are strong about. Strength is a narrative value that is more important than any other value. So the idea that, he's wrong but he's strong, the wrong element is negated by the strong element. It doesn't make any difference if he's wrong, because it doesn't make any difference what he's strong about. It's the strength that is the imperative here. It's the strength that is the narrative value. In movies, we have people going about, whether it's Schwarzenegger or whoever it is, we have heroes going about doing their thing individualistically, and we don't really think all that much about what it is they are setting out to do. That's what Alfred Hitchcock called the MacGuffin. And in a sense, all of politics, every issue in politics is a MacGuffin. It's all irrelevant if you're strong. And if you are the actor within that master narrative, tailored in this way. And Bush did something else. it seems to me, Bush or Rove or whomever, within this version, is that he didn't present himself as Rambo. The idea wasn't, I'm so strong that I will run over anything. The strength had a kind of almost loony romantic element. The idea, I will bring democracy everywhere. In a sense, it occurred to me as I was watching this campaign that Bush was starring in Field of Dreams. That's what his version of the narrative was. Build it and they'll come. Ah, but you're crazy. What are you doing? Doesn't make any difference. See, have faith. Even the father-son element works in this if you really want to go Freudian. But the idea was, his narrative was Field of Dreams. And he was saying, look it, are you going to buy Field of Dreams? Are you going to buy my looniness? Even, are you going to forgive my looniness on the basis that it's looniness with a purpose? It's romantic looniness. It expresses my strength. Are you going to do that? Now, interestingly, Carey, within his own, individualized, tailored plot, said he was going to be Rambo. That was essentially a kind of mild version of Rambo. What Carey set out as his own plot was, I'm a hero. I'm a hero. I'm a hero. And we all know that, again, it was very overt in the same way that Bush's was overt. The plot was, you can't attack me because I'm heroic. And there are basically two kinds of protagonists in our movies. There's the charismatic hero and there's the plain-spoken common man. That's essentially the dichotomy. Bush clearly chose, I'm the plain-spoken common guy with a purpose, and I'm going to follow it through. And Carey, alternatively, since there was no way he could pose himself as the common man, said, I'm going to take on the idea of the heroic figure. So immediately the election kind of conforms itself to the two main heroic types in American culture. The problem is that there is yet another set of narratives, what I would call the counter-narrative. It's not enough to present a narrative of your own. What you must do, because these narratives are vying with one another in a way, as I say, that movies and television programs don't, what you have to do then is provide a counter-narrative that does two things. That negates your opponent's narrative and that defines your opponent. So when the Swiftboat veterans came out and attacked Carey's narrative, they immediately knocked out the very basis of Carey's heroism and the very basis of that entire narrative. And what they did, interestingly, is they converted his Rambo narrative into Apocalypse Now. So now, what you had is an election, Field of Dreams versus Apocalypse Now. Need I tell you which is going to win, that kind of battle? There is no doubt which was going to prevail. The counterplot also was very interesting in that, and this I think may be the single most important narrative component of the entire campaign. Bush and Rove, or whoever came up with this, decided, and this is why I said I didn't talk about the Democratic master plot earlier, this is the real narrative. The real narrative is, and I will risk sounding French here, the real narrative is the narrative of no narrative. Because what we have here is, look everybody, our story is that they have no story. What's his story? He's got this heroism thing, well, we already knocked that out. What's the master plot? And what's the individual plot? Folks, I'm building Field of Dreams. I'm going to build it and they'll come. I'm a loony, but I believe in my lunacy. They have no narrative. And how many times in this campaign did you hear the narrative of no narrative? Again and again and again, every single day. They don't have any narrative. They didn't use the word narrative, but they don't, what does he stand for? He doesn't mean anything. Flip-flop is the two-word version of the narrative of no narrative. He's a flip-flopper because he doesn't have any narrative. And when you talk about values, ultimately, this is what values really resolves itself into. Values equals plot. We've got values because we got a plot. I'm strong. That's my plot. Those are my values. They have no values because they have no plot. And when the narrative of no narrative became the narrative, I'm telling you, if you were a Democrat or you were John Kerry, there was trouble. Now, let's bring into this mix another component, which is aesthetics. Because, it's one thing to write the plot. But all plots, when they're realized, have an aesthetic component, not only a narrative component. So it's not enough just to write the plot. I mean, you will have, perhaps 4 years from now, Bill Frist trying to act or perform the GOP master plot. And unless he changes, you can see in your gut that this is going to be a hard sell. Because Bill Frist doesn't have the aesthetics to perform that master plot, even as it is tailored to his own dimensions. It will be very difficult. Bush's aesthetics are obviously, it's apparent. I mean, Bush has done everything in his life. In fact, it's almost by design to create the common man hero aesthetic. Which is why this notion that he's dumb never has any traction. In fact, if it has traction, it's positive traction. There's no problem being dumb when you're running for president. I mean, it just doesn't, it's meaningless. It's positive because it means that you are not an elitist. It means that you're plain spoken. It means that you may not know how to articulate it, but it doesn't make any difference because conviction is what counts. And your inability to articulate something in some ways is an advantage in proving how deep your convictions run. And it's all of a piece, as we all know. I mean, clearing the brush constantly on that ranch. The ranch, there's more brush than any ranch in the history of the world. How much damn brush is there? And the boots, and the shirts, and the flubs themselves, some of which I believe are probably deliberate. All of these are of a piece in saying, I'm not only in the narrative of Field of Dreams, but you know what kind of guy I am within that narrative. You know exactly what you're dealing with here. I'm one of you. There is no question. I'm one of you. I mean, he was essentially designed to play this role, and he plays it very well. And as much as you can, knock him, denigrate him, I mean, you have to understand the power of that role in the larger narrative. Kerry, on the other hand, genetically, and it is genetic. I mean, I thought in this election, I'll just take a small digression here. Let's say you had a CGI, who could completely redo Kerry, completely redo Bush. Essentially, their voices were the same, which is obviously an aesthetic component, but everything else is different. How different would this election have been if John Kerry didn't look like John Kerry? Now, in saying that, I mean, there's a certain pathos in saying that an election is largely dependent not on even something like moral values, but on the fact that a man has a long face. But I'll tell you, after a lifetime of movie going, that's how we react to people. And these candidates are not candidates, they are actors. And if you can then take that look and kind of gin up the aesthetic, he's French. You know, he's elitist. He's not one of us. You know, he tries to be one of us, but the dichotomy between how he looks and what he's trying to do is another instance of the fact that he has no narrative. So, in even trying to neutralize his own aesthetic, all he winds up doing is reinforcing the narrative of no narrative. I mean, here's a guy who's not comfortable in his own skin. And of course he's not comfortable in his own skin because, you know, he's French. Look at the way he looks. Look at the way he talks. This guy is not one of us. And where you saw this, it seems to me, is on the moment of Kerry's greatest triumph, which was the debates. Now, take a step back and look at the analysis of the debates. The analysis of the debates are, Kerry looked presidential and sounded presidential. And Bush fumbled and seemed kind of unpresidential. And if you were to look at this and you were asked who's the president and who isn't, you know, you would have identified Kerry as the president. Whether you believe that or not, how thoroughly does that debase the entire process? One person looks presidential, the other person does not. Outside of the blogs, there was virtually no analysis of the merits of what either man said during that debate. Almost none. You had to go online. And then the bloggers, because there is at least some gram of shame left in the press, although a very slight one in the mainstream press, occasionally they would respond to the blogging because they know that there are, you know, millions of people who read these things and then read the New York Times or the LA Times and would say, what, are you complete morons? Which, the answer to which, of course, is yes. And I say this also because one of the reasons that you have the dominance of aesthetics and the dominance of narrative is because the media love this stuff. It's essentially about all they can do. Aesthetic criticism is so much easier. Anyone who's ever been a film critic can tell you this, and I speak from personal experience, than doing the really hard work of analyzing policy, of weighing one set of policies against another. That's difficult work that people are not particularly interested in to begin with. And so political coverage has been, for a long time, almost always theater coverage. It's coverage of the aesthetics. And the media love to do it this way because, as William Salatin of Slate admitted just a couple of weeks ago, he said, look it, maybe 5 reporters in America know anything about economics, but hundreds of reporters write about it. He said, you know, the fact of the matter is something which I say on Newswatch almost every week. Reporters are lazy and they are stupid. And, yeah, I mean, nobody wants to say this, but let's say it. Let's come out. Why do you get Jody Wilgerin in the New York Times talking only about how much John Kerry's lunch cost? Or writing a front-page story on John Kerry's butler? Why? This is the New York Times. This is the coverage that 100 years from now, someone may actually look at a campaign, at the campaign coverage, and say, this is how the campaign was covered, and it's covered that way because they can't do any better. Now, there's one other set of aesthetics that I want to get to because it's also very, very important. I've talked about candidate aesthetics. But there are also campaign aesthetics. And they're very, very important for this reason. One of the narratives in this campaign is the inevitability of Bush's election or re-election. It was everywhere. It was even on the blogs. Why? Because Karl Rove cannot be beaten. Karl Rove cannot be beaten. Republicans walk in lockstep. Republicans are always on message. Republicans never make mistakes. Republicans organize better than anybody else. This is a narrative that gets blasted on a daily basis through this election and presumably through the next one and the one after that, even when Karl Rove has left the scene. In fact, let's see, if you've read the post-mortem, which is a perfectly accurate way of describing it, in Newsweek, the issue-length post-mortem, I thought this is very interesting. And it also shows you the myopia of the press itself. They said here, the Bushies almost seemed to feel sorry for the Kerry campaign. How many times have we heard this narrative? In a condescending sort of way, under constant scrutiny, all candidates misstepped during the course of a long campaign. At his April press conference, Bush, frozen in front of the cameras, had been unable to think of a single mistake he had made since 9/11. In August, the president told a reporter that the war on terror was unwinnable and had to hastily clarify his remarks. In his familiar role of Dr. Doom, the designated hitman, Vice President Cheney suggested outrageously that by voting for Kerry, Americans would be inviting another terrorist attack. Yet Bush and Cheney seemed to waltz away from their clumsy or embarrassing moments. Kerry, on the other hand, just dug himself into deeper holes. Somehow, and I think somehow is the key word here, this shows the absolute inability of the press to be introspective in any way, shape, or form. Somehow, I'll tell you somehow, the Bush-Cheney campaign was able to keep Kerry's mistakes in the news, while the Kerry campaign was unable to do likewise with Bush's blunders. The press loves the aesthetics of tyranny. They would have loved Goebbels. They love the idea, and I think there's a gigantic narcissism in this, of all of this energy being devoted to manipulating them. And they judge a campaign on the basis of how well they are manipulated. So they sit back and they say, all right, manipulate us. And do it well. Because if you do it poorly, then we will call you on it. Dukakis on a 10. Oh, come on. Did you really think we were that dumb? We're not that stupid. Now we're really going to knock the stuffing out of you. But the importance of the aesthetics of tyranny as a value for the media cannot be overstated. It's absolutely essential. And it permeates the entire narrative. Because there is a very short step, which the media makes, from they can't run their own campaign to they can't run the government. Or everybody walks in lockstep, everybody stays on message to that's the kind of government we're going to have. Now, if you're not particularly fond of democratic values, this is a perfectly wonderful thing. If you are fond of democratic values, it may not be. But if you're speaking not in terms of political values, but in terms of aesthetic values, this is terrific. We all want the trains to run on time. It doesn't make any difference if Bush is only talking to his own. If nobody else can get in. If somebody wearing a Kerry t-shirt is forbidden from getting inside of that, while Kerry opens up his speeches to anybody. In the press's eyes, Kerry's a fool for doing that. In fact, here is an object lesson. Anybody who read this Newsweek piece, it's an object lesson of the very thing I'm just talking about. Because Kerry clearly gave them complete access. So they're talking about the problems he has with his wife, and Bush gave them no access. Right here, without reading a word of this, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. They love Bush. They love him. Because Bush wouldn't give in to them. And they castigate Kerry for being dumb enough to actually give them full access. What kind of a moron are you to do that? Now, we're running out of time. I just want to... I'm not a prescriptive person. Anybody who reads my work knows that. I'm not someone who says, all right, here's the diagnosis and this is the medicine you take. God knows there's a lot of medicine we'd like to be taking. Some of it's arsenic. And, you know, I'm among you on that.
Zoloft.
Yeah, Zoloft won't do. I mean, I'm one of these people who believes, and I'm generally not a pessimist, that we are in for 4 years of hell like you've never seen. And we're beginning to see it now. I'm one of the people who believe, and I've written about this, that this election was a referendum on whether we are a liberal democracy or a theocracy, and I think you're seeing the results of that now. Whether we can survive as a liberal democracy, this, in my estimation, was the most important election since 1860, and danger lurks ahead. But I will say this, and I'm not hopeful, I'm very hopeless. There's no reason to be hopeful, frankly, none whatsoever. But I will say this: if elections are determined on the basis of narrative and on the basis of aesthetics, then the Democratic Party, and even if you're a Republican, unless you're Karl Rove who believes in a one-party system, should subscribe to this. The Democratic Party has to devise a master narrative. It has lacked one since Franklin Roosevelt, and it needs one now. And it needs one that is powerful enough to compete with the very powerful narrative of individualism that the Republicans have used for quite a long time. And if they are to contend in an election again, or to become the Tories of England, which I think is the real threat, they need a performer with the aesthetics to play out that narrative. Because elections, as I said earlier, are waged and won on the basis of narratives and aesthetics. The other side, in my estimation, because I'm on this side, has the narratives, and this year they had the aesthetics. If the Democrats don't learn that lesson, they will not contend, they will not win.
Neil, you should know that in this room there is diversity.
Oh, I know.
There are people,
In this country there is diversity.
There are people here who voted for George Bush and look forward to the future with pleasure, not with fear. And there are people who would defend to the death the quality of American mainstream journalism.
I don't doubt that.
That's in this room, and I'm trying to make a friendly space for expressing those opinions. But also, I'm going to, much as I want to call on John Taplin and others, I first want to call on students. So please.
What do you think of, on the one hand, Barack Obama as an exemplar and a describer of the new master narrative for the Democrats? And what do you see as the failures of Fahrenheit 9/11 and its kin as a counter-narrative against the Republicans?
Well, first of all, let me start with Fahrenheit 9/11. I mean, Fahrenheit 9/11 is not a master narrative, it's a counter-narrative. And, I think it's reasonably effective in what it does. It's preaching to the choir. It's not something that, it doesn't present a narrative that I think has a lot of room to get other people into the narrative. But I also don't think, as we're seeing now, that the Democratic Party wants to distance itself from that. I think that would also be a mistake. As I said, conviction is paramount. You have to have conviction. Whether you believe that Bush's convictions are wrong or not, as I do. I mean, they're dangerously wrong. Not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. The point is that the American people believed that he had conviction. And they didn't believe, I think, or at least 51% didn't believe. And again, I think that's important parenthetically. The Republicans have spun this as if, they have won this giant mandate. We hear this all the time, and of course, since the mainstream press, which I believe is indefensible, so I don't know anybody who defends the mainstream press, that the mainstream press is already genuflected before this idea. that there was this giant mandate handed to him. I mean, there's still an awful lot of people, who don't subscribe to the whole Republican agenda. But Barack Obama is a very interesting thing. I mean, I think Barack Obama had the beginning of a narrative, the beginning of one. Ultimately, as I said, there are kind of two heroic types in America. There's the plain-spoken man and the charismatic hero. I think ultimately, fundamentally, there are two master narratives in America. There is the one I described, which is we are all individuals, we are all in this alone, we are all responsible for ourselves, and anything else that inhibits our own personal responsibility, is a danger. And then there is what I believe is what Barack Obama is beginning to say, and what I will say right now, to my mind, ought to be the Democratic master narrative. So I'm never prescriptive, but I will be now. And that is that we are not all alone. That 280 million people operating separately is not a country. Only 280 million people operating together is a country. That there are things we must do together. There are things we cannot do alone. And that's what government is for. Government is not our enemy. Government is not opposed to us. Government is not a separate entity from us. Government is us. And the job of government is to do those things, limited though they may be now, to do those things we cannot do alone. The narrative is about community. It's about how we must act together. It's about a cowboy versus an army. Those are the two basic ideas of this country. Either you are alone, there is no one there for you, that's it, or you are a part of a great enterprise that we can only realize if we do it together. David Brooks is very fond of talking about national greatness conservatism. It's meaningless to me. I don't really know what it means, but it's a way that he can, modify himself enough to be palatable to the so-called mainstream liberal press. But I do believe that there is something that we might project as national greatness liberalism. All the things that this country hasn't done, that it can do if we act together. Red states and blue states. Individuals all over. I am not a great believer that this country is, as culturally polarized as many of the pundits would have you believe. I think that, on a plain, a mountain stands out. And there is that mountain of evangelicals who do act together, vote together, and believe together. But they're a relatively small percentage of this country.
I want to see how many questions. I should have asked you to say your name and where you're from.
I'm Aaron Sinrock. I'm a doctoral student at Annenberg.
And you, your name and where you're from.
My name is Michael Russo. I'm from Bloomington, Indiana. Which kind of leads me to my question, which is we have a pretty convenient distance from the epicenter of the evangelical movement 2,000 miles away. But I think it's rather easy, and even the people on the Beltway are guilty of this, it's rather easy to forget about them as a voting bloc, but they really do wield a lot of influence. That's my opinion, and I think that maybe even they've been underestimated, even in the post-election analysis, just working with them on a daily basis in my everyday life. But my real question was, you touched on the press and them not being able to do any better, but wouldn't really, at the end of the day, it just be a matter of the American people not really wanting any better than what they're getting right now?
There are two models of the American press that go all the way back, which is the press serves the public interest, that's our job. And that's on one side. And the other side is that the press serves the public's interest, meaning what's the public is interested in. Once upon a time, there was no question that you had tabloid press that served what the public was interested in, and you had the mainstream press that served the public interest. And editors and publishers saw themselves as custodians of the public interest. That was their job. They didn't ask themselves, geez, do you think people will be interested in this? They did it. They did it because they understood that a democracy needs an inquisitive, an engaged press. They did it because it was the right thing to do. Those days are over. Those days are virtually over. And as someone who has to professionally read newspapers and magazines and the internet on a daily basis, reading the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune, and other papers every single day, I can tell you that they are not serving the public interest. They even know it. Now, why is that so? I mean, it's a chicken and egg question, of course. I mean, is it that Hull Raines, the whole Hull Raines paradigm is that you hire people who are exciting, who get the scoop, who want to be stars, and because that's what, the public wants? Is that why it is? Or is it because people who are going into journalism don't have the stamina, the intelligence, whatever one wants to say? I'm sure there are journalism students in this room that I'll be insulting, but so what? And they don't have the curiosity, whatever it is, to perform that public service. I think it's a little of both. But in the final analysis, anyone who followed the election on the basis of the major newspapers and broadcast networks was not well informed about what was going on. And if you didn't go into the blogosphere on a daily basis to find out what real reporters, who are actually with real shoe leather and real context, were doing, you didn't know. And anybody who reads the blogs on a regular basis knows this. This was the real media story of this campaign.
John Taplin.
I was interested in your notion that the Republican narrative of the common, rugged individual, which is really formed out of being out of power for a long period of time. I mean, pretty much Barry Goldwater on, and finally Reagan, they got a president. But now that they control all three branches of government, isn't that rugged individualism narrative going to run up against a different narrative, which is they are the government, they are the centralized nanny state that's going to tell California you can't pass a emissions law, going to tell gays you can't get married, or tell states they can't do this, the Patriot Act 2, which pushes against the kind of libertarian side of their coalition. I mean, all of these issues were basically, they're now the central government, they're big, and they're against the individualism of other places.
Well, I think you're absolutely, I talk to libertarians, and in fact, Jim Pinkerton was on the show with me as a libertarian, and he was against Bush. And I think that libertarian strain is peeling away, and the ideologically conservative strain, has stayed, but there are clearly tensions because the fiscal conservatives, the non-forward adventurism conservatives, the non-government intrusion conservatives. In fact, one could say that anyone who's really conservative has got to be scratching his head and saying, what the heck is this? We didn't bargain for any of this. This is not the conservatism that Barry Goldwater had laid out, or even that Ronald Reagan had laid out. But because the narratives are so powerful, they overwhelm fact. And if this election has proven anything, I think it's proven that a narrative can overwhelm everything else. So they run against themselves. They will still attack government. They will still say how bad government is. They will still say that you've got to shrink government. But the facts show, as everyone who's reading knows, Bush has grown government far more than Bill Clinton did. Far more. But it doesn't make any difference. Because when you've got a narrative and you've got facts, what are you going to believe?
One of the rules of narrative is without conflict, no drama. So in the interest of injecting some drama, anyone want to contest vehemently some aspect? Yes, Tom. Tom Hollihan.
Neil, I want to thank you for a very provocative talk, about half of which I found myself enthusiastically agreeing with, and about half of which I wanted to...
Then I did my job.
Because I have to agree with the argument that elections are conducted through narrative, that we evaluate the worth of candidates on the basis of how well both their story appeals to us and how well they as character types play out the role in the narrative. And I couldn't agree more that Kerry undermines his own narrative. You know, he salutes us at the Democratic Convention, and then we know that within days we're going to see all his anti-war statements coming back to flaw who he is as a character. But what the part of your talk I really want to refute is the notion that the press was not observant of some of these things. Particularly, I want to protest your claim that we didn't get coverage of how the entire Bush campaign was essentially an orchestrated, reality TV show where even the characters in the auditorium weren't real because they had to volunteer for service to be in there. I thought the press was all over the top.
I totally agree with you.
And
totally
and
agree with
got
you.
reported consistently. And with regard to the Newsweek argument you made, I would contrast the coverage of the Kerry campaign with the coverage that John McCain got when he was running 4 years ago, when what the press absolutely celebrated was his access. Here's a candidate who lets us sit on the bus with him, and we have 3 and 4 hour at a time open press conferences, no issues off the table. And so I would submit that some of your criticism is really not fair to a lot of journalists who are working very hard to tell the story. I think the part of the criticism reflected in the question is, do Americans get the kind of press they deserve?
Right.
Well, they get the kind of press they demand. And do they get the kind of politics that they deserve? Well, they get the kind of politics that they allow politicians to get away with. And so we ought to be concerned, but I don't think we should make the press carry as much water for the mess we're in as you say.
Well, actually, we are not in disagreement. I'm sorry to say, I absolutely agree with you that the press did cover the machinations of the Bush campaign, but what they didn't do, in covering the machinations, there was always the sense that this was great. This was amazing. Look at how on message, how manipulative this is, how well organized. It was always with a certain kind of awe that these guys just don't make a mistake. And I thought we might get our Mike Tyson, Buster Douglas moment after the first debate, by which I mean, Mike Tyson was as inevitable as Karl Rove and as infallible as Karl Rove until Buster Douglas knocked him on his keister, in Japan. And from that point on, he was just a chump, a tomato can. And I thought that after that first debate, we might have had Karl Rove as tomato can. All right, it's all over. Pull back the curtain. It's the Wizard of Oz. It's finished. Almost literally the Wizard of Oz if you think he had a transmitter on it. But it didn't happen that way. I mean, the press didn't react that way. They wanted to see whether he was going to get back on the horse, Karl Rove, and he did. So, I agree with you that they covered it, but I think the tone with which they covered it was, again, admiring rather than not. In terms of do we get the press we deserve, well, it's a market-driven economy, and as Hull Raines said at great length in The Atlantic, even the New York Times is now a market-driven newspaper. I was only making those changes at the New York Times because I didn't believe we could compete otherwise. So if you want to blame me, blame yourself. Because it's a tough market, and what we're competing against is, Entertainment Tonight and the New York Post and cable news and all of these things, and they're the ones who essentially set the default mechanisms for us. That may be true, but it's a sad state of affairs. And I believe that there must be a certain kind of courage among journalists to resist it.
For those of you who can stay around, I think Neil will be available to continue the discussion formally. And for everyone, please join me in thanking Neil.
Thank you. Thank you. Did it work?
Really great.